Hey, Mr. Chairman, Mr. Bessent, welcome. Thank you for your willingness to serve. I want to just start by refuting one of the false narratives we hear ad nauseum from the other side, that the Tax Cut and Jobs Act was the primary cause of our deficits. It's just not true. So I'm going to actually use the facts from CBO. Again, this isn't to confirm CBO numbers. This actually shows you why we ought to take CBO projections with a grain of salt. After its passage, CBO projected 10 years, but I mean for 7 years that we just experienced, total revenue of $27 trillion. Actual revenue was $28.7 trillion. That's, to do the math, that's $1.7 trillion more than what CBO estimated, which shows that the original score was $1.5 trillion lost revenue. So we not only paid for the tax cut, in 7 years, we generated $200 billion more revenue, even with the COVID recession. So again, we need to take CBO scores with a real grain of salt. But I hope this committee understands what Senator Graham was talking about in terms of your humble beginnings and your tremendous American success story. And so I want to ask you a hypothetical, because you understand American families. If an American family, let's say they normally spend $100,000, have a serious health crisis, and so in 1 year, they have to spend $50,000 on medical bills. But then, fortunately, that family member gets well. What would that family spend the next year? Just real quick.
Unless they have more income, they'd spend
probably $100,000.
They'd spend the same 100 and probably have debt costs associated with that.
Right. They certainly wouldn't do what the federal government has done. In 2019, before the pandemic, we spent $4.4 trillion. In 2020, we spent $6.6 trillion. When the pandemic ended, we didn't really reduce spending. For the last 5 years, we've averaged $6.5 trillion. Last year, spending $6.9 trillion. Mr. Bessent, is there any justification for keeping spending levels at this level?
Senator Johnson, as I've said repeatedly, the United States does not have a revenue problem. We have a spending problem.
So the question is, how do we reset spending levels to a reasonable pre-pandemic level? I wrote a column in the Wall Street Journal. I laid out a couple scenarios, and let me just give you the guts of it. If you take one of the pre-pandemic years and increase all the spending by population and inflation, by the way, that's what families would do as well. But you exempt Social Security, Medicare, and interest, and use President Biden's 2025 budget, because you spend what we plan on spending this year. If you take Bill Clinton's 1998 spending, I don't think he spent too little back in 1998, we would be having a baseline of $5.5 trillion. If you took President Obama's 2014 spending levels, it'd be $6.2 trillion. The one I like the best, though, is if we use President Trump's 2021 budget, his estimates for spending in 2025, and use, again, just use those numbers, but slot in Social Security, Medicare, and interest as they are. Nobody's touching those. We'd be spending about $6 trillion. So wouldn't that be a reasonable level? Somewhere between $5.5 and $6 trillion as a baseline spending to project our next 10 years.
Senator, I look forward to working with you on this, that you've clearly done more work than I have. And this looks like a very good starting point to me to figure out how we've gotten into this spending morass.
So it sounds like pretty reasonable approach to me. By the way, I'd take 1998. I'd use Clinton's spending levels for this. I also want to refute this current CBO score on extending the TCJA. Back then, they scored the whole thing as $1.5 trillion. If you just inflate that the same way CBI, according to CPI, it'd be $2 trillion. How do they justify a score of $4.3 to $4.6 trillion? It makes no sense. So again, I think we need to take those estimates with a huge grain of salt. My final point, I heard the ranking member talk about inflation and the cost of living. Because we've incurred these massive deficits, a 1998 dollar today is only worth 51 cents. A 2014 dollar today is only worth 74 cents. A 2019 dollar is only worth 80 cents. That was caused by this massive deficit spending, the devaluation of the dollar, and a lot of devaluations occurred over the last 4 years because we spent too much money. Not because we didn't tax America enough, it's because we spent way too much money. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. Senator Cantwell.